The soldier's face burned as if tiny needles were piercing his skin. The temperature was below 40 degrees, but the wind chill made it plummet further. Huddled on the frozen hillside, surrounded by silent comrades, he had waited for hours. All around him, the frigid North Korean night stretched on as they awaited the orders to attack. The Americans were out there, dug in and ready to defend the Chosin Reservoir. Desperate to move, he stumbled over the uneven, frozen ground, searching for the neighboring company. Each step felt like a battle, his legs numb. The howling wind whipped around him. He crested the hill, calling out, but his voice was lost in the darkness. When he reached the first soldier, his heart stopped. Frozen faces stared back at him. They were all dead, ice statues in the snow. Fear gripped him. His chest tightened with every second. Stay and he would freeze just like his comrades. But running meant charging into the storm of American gunfire. His heart pounded. His breath came in panicked gasps. Time was running out, and he only had seconds to decide. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we'll tell you the story of how an entire Chinese army almost froze to death. On June 25, 1950, swarms of North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel, igniting a conflict that would soon reshape the region. At the same time, across the border in China, the High Command had no intention of getting embroiled in a foreign war. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, was focused on the destruction of the last nationalist strongholds in Taiwan, Hainan, and nearly 50 other islands off the mainland. Among the Chinese army units selected to crush the nationalists systematically were the men of the 9th Army, one of China's most elite units. These veterans had fought the Japanese for the bulk of World War II before immediately turning their guns on the nationalist formations in China. By the summer of 1950, Communist forces had overrun almost every remaining nationalist outpost, and the CCP was preparing for its grand assault on Taiwan. The Communists had amassed around 300,000 troops in southern China. 150,000 men from the 9th Army had been chosen to lead the charge. However, events on the Korean peninsula suddenly changed everything for the CCP. As the Korean War raged on, General MacArthur executed his master stroke, a daring amphibious landing behind enemy lines at Incheon. This resulted in a complete rout of the North Korean military. Initially, the elite 9th Army was not a part of this action, but the lightning-fast offensive of U.S. troops soon forced China's hand. In early October, Mao personally informed the commander of the 9th Army that their mission had changed. They would no longer be invading Taiwan. Instead, they would head to Shandong, where they would spend 2 months training for winter warfare. But even this plan fell apart. By the time the 9th Army had reached Shandong, the situation in North Korea had worsened. U.S. forces had captured Pyongyang, and with fewer than 20,000 Chinese troops stationed in the east of North Korea, the CCP ordered an immediate deployment. Instead of spending 2 months in training, the men of the 9th Army received only 1 week of preparation before embarking for the front. This decision proved to be disastrous. Upon their arrival, Chinese officers were horrified to find that many of their troops were unprepared for the brutal North Korean winter that awaited them. The men were dressed in canvas shoes with quilted cotton uniforms. Their cold weather gear consisted of little more than light jackets. Panicked by the sight, Chinese officers at the train station immediately commandeered over 600 winter coats to try to protect their men from the impending cold. Despite their best efforts, this was hardly enough to clothe the 10,000 soldiers of the 59th Division. Over the coming days, Chinese logisticians scrambled to find 72,000 winter coats for the 9th Army. More than half of the men would head into the coldest Korean winter on record with nothing more than a light shirt between them and the freezing temperatures. With a lack of trucks and treacherous mountain roads in the remote part of North Korea, the 9th Army abandoned almost all of their artillery, heavy weapons, and supplies. Each man carried around 80 rounds of rifle ammunition. Each soldier turned into a pack mule, carrying nearly 1,300 tons of ordnance that the army had. After the first night, the 58th Division of the 20th Corps lost 700 men to frostbite. This was not just a tactical loss, it was a descent into hell for those who survived. One veteran recalled soldiers having to sleep with their shoes on during the night. If they took them off, by morning their feet were so swollen from frostbite they couldn't get their boots back on. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, the 9th Army was hit by another blow: a lack of food. The average soldier of the 9th Army left China with around 3 to 8 days worth of rations. The march from the border to the Chosin Reservoir was to take around 18 days. Soldiers marched at night to avoid air attacks and slept through the day. The lack of proper food was starting to take its toll. Soldiers were growing weaker, slower, more vulnerable. Veterans recall how the kindness of the North Korean villagers helped them survive. Some had to forage for potatoes. Others resorted to eating any cat, dog, or rat they could get their hands on. Soldiers were too tired or weak to continue walking. They fell behind their comrades, promising they would catch up when they felt better. They would lie down in the snow to rest, never to wake up again. Headquarters knew they were running out of time. If they didn't solve this food crisis, the Ninth Army would starve to death long before they ever faced an American soldier. The solution was to enlist thousands of Chinese and Korean civilians. An astounding 150,000 pounds of bread per day was baked by civilians and delivered to the marching army. But the reality on the ground was grave. Much of this precious food never reached the starving soldiers of the Ninth. Desertion spread like wildfire throughout the ranks. Entire companies simply quit marching forward. One battalion commander abandoned his troops and met a swift and brutal fate. He was personally executed by the commander of the Ninth Army. But after 18 days of hell, the Ninth Army finally closed in on the Chosin Reservoir. The Americans were within reach. Despite all that they had endured, the men were now posed for one final decisive strike. But the worst was yet to come. On the eve of the battle, the Ninth Army had a bold plan: encircle the Americans and systematically annihilate them. But the reality couldn't have been more different. After 2 brutal weeks of marching through sub-zero temperatures, the Chinese soldiers were in no shape to fight. The soldiers of the Ninth Army were weaker, slower, and more exhausted than their American counterparts. To make matters worse, the soldiers had been forced to abandon their heavy weapons in China. They were being sent into battle with just their rifles, bayonets, and grenades. Only a handful of small artillery pieces and mortars would provide fire support. But even reaching the battlefield wasn't guaranteed. One veteran said on the first day of the battle, they were waiting for hours to attack with no word. As they lay down in the snow, the men usually paired up 2 to 3 soldiers under a single blanket, hugging each other for warmth. When the attack signal came, the men expected to rush forward in a human wave to overwhelm the enemy. But this simply did not happen. As the men rose to charge the Americans, they could barely stand up. They were stiff, struggling to run. Their weapons were useless, frozen solid, and unable to fire. Even infantry weapons were affected. American bullets easily cut them down. One veteran recalled the sheer terror as he tried to cycle a new round into his bolt-action rifle, but the bolt was frozen solid. Panicking, he tossed the rifle aside and reached for a hand grenade, but the cold had frozen his fingers together, locking them in place. He couldn't even pull the safety pin. With no other choice, he charged straight at an American machine gun, armed with nothing but a knife. After overrunning the first American positions, the soldiers stopped advancing despite their officers' urging. The dead Americans had warm boots and plenty of food for them to eat. Instead of pressing the attack, the Chinese pillaged the supplies that they needed to survive. As the battle progressed, the temperature dropped further every day. Due to the overwhelming American air power, the Chinese resorted to conducting most of their attacks at night. As they lay in a ravine waiting for the order to attack, the men tried to get some sleep. They could only sleep for an hour at a time before their comrades had to wake them up so they wouldn't freeze to death. During his turn to be awake, one man decided to walk over to a neighboring company to see how they were doing. But upon arriving at their positions, he found a terrifying scene. The entire company, more than 100 men, were frozen solid on the ground. These soldiers, exhausted from weeks of hard marching and combat, simply fell asleep, and none of them woke up. It was clear the men couldn't wait any longer for the order to attack. If they did, they would freeze to death before they even had a chance to fight. The brutal cold was as deadly as any enemy, and waiting would mean certain death. Many of them decided that a bullet from the Americans was better than slowly freezing to death in the snow. By December 6th, the temperature had plunged to a brutal 45 degrees below zero. The U.S. Marines, determined to eliminate a nearby rifle company, planned a daring early morning attack on the Chinese forces. As the Marines assembled that morning, they charged up the hill, expecting gunfire at any moment. The hill was deathly silent. Had the Chinese abandoned their post? As the Marines crested the hill, they expected a close-quarters fight. But what was found was even more chilling. The cold had done the job for them. The entire company of Chinese troops was frozen stiff in their foxholes. Over the next few weeks, the cold and American steel continued to inflict horrendous casualties on the Ninth Army. Cold weather casualties even surpassed combat losses in some units. The 79th Division suffered almost 2,150 combat casualties, but lost a further 2,300 men to frostbite. The Chinese High Command realized this battle would soon be over. By December 15th, the Chinese halted their advance and let the Americans evacuate virtually unopposed. Around 150,000 men stepped off the line of departure in early November 1950. By December 15th, the Chinese army reported at least 19,000 battle casualties and a staggering 29,000 men lost because of the elements. After the battle, Mao Zedong congratulated the men of the Ninth Army on their victory, even inquiring if they had enough hot food and warm clothing. But these words were too late. For the soldiers of the Ninth Army, it was a hollow gesture. These men had experienced a level of cold and deprivation that few soldiers in history have ever known. What do you think? Was this mission doomed from the start? What would you have done in their situation? Let us know in the comments below. Now go watch the insanely crazy story of a tiny soldier, or click on this video instead.